Welcome to Leading for Life Stories, Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Regardless of whether you're a seasoned listener who's been with me since the beginning, or whether you've just dropped in for the occasional episode, I really hope you enjoy the mix of content that I provide, the personal stories, the thematic episodes, and the guests that I have on the show. And I hope you find it all interesting and at least some of it useful. And without further ado, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. I thought I'd continue on with a personal story this week because it was an interesting time for me. I've just talked about in the last one that I was handing over Coningsby as the station commander and moving from that into a different world. And boy, was it a different world. I've entitled this episode Back to the Classroom because that's essentially what it was. And it was really tough anyway to hand over the base at the end of what was an amazing 2 years. You know it's coming if you're in those kind of roles, and that's an inevitable consequence of it. But it still is a real wrench to go from that, where you're running 1 minute running a base with 2,500 people on it, and obviously all that goes with that. And then you suddenly drop into the sort of maelstrom of normal life. And in my case, going off to go and do a couple of courses, which were going to take the whole of the next year. The whole of 2007 was occupied with doing two very important and very enjoyable and incredibly rewarding courses. But nonetheless, it was back into the classroom, essentially. And that was why I thought this was a good title. And of course, you're sort of slightly hero to zero. You've come from a really big command job where everyone is really looking to you to lead the base and everything else. And suddenly you're just back in the normal mix and you're meeting up with a bunch of people who are basically in the same position as you and doing stuff that was really interesting. But, you know, you're just kind of back as ordinary Joe, if you like. And that again takes some getting used to. And it was one of the features of service life that was often the case. You'd go from huge jobs to much smaller jobs in terms of span of command and responsibility. But obviously you're paid the same, and that doesn't change with that's associated with rank rather than anything else. And you just kind of get on with it. But it was a little weird all the time when that happened. And this was certainly no exception, because you come away from being a base commander into a world where you're really not quite sure whether you've got any kind of job like that coming up again. It could be that's almost certainly was the end of my flying career properly. And now it's slightly into the unknown and the lap of the gods in terms of where you're going to go for future postings. So it was a really interesting professional point, I suppose, for my life. It was also an interesting personal one because, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode, I got married again. So I'd been married previously, but this time I got married to the lady who is still my wife 18 years later, and who I love very dearly. And that was a big moment, obviously, to do that. And what was hugely amusing was we'd been seeing each other for a while, obviously, and she'd been frequently visiting me at Coningsby and was very much part of the firmament in terms of what I was doing as a station commander, and was involved very actively in some of the big visits we had there and things like that. But when we then took over a married quarter, I took over a married quarter down at Bushy Heath in Hertfordshire, near Watford, north of London, for those that know the area. And I was very clearly told when we took over the quarter that we hadn't actually got married at this point, that we were not allowed to live in it until we'd actually got married, which was just hugely amusing. That you kind of go, really? This is 2007. Is this the world we want to be in? Not that it made any difference, because we were already planning to get married, and we did. We went to St. Lucia and did that, and we had a fabulous time in St. Lucia with a very, very small wedding, and absolutely loved it, and it was terrific. Before any of that had happened, and before I'd actually left Coningsby, I knew that I was going to the Higher Command and Staff course for the first of these two courses I mentioned in 2007. And the reading list arrived along with the box of books that essentially was required reading before you arrived on the course. And this was pretty intimidating because it was quite a big box of books. I mean, I like reading, but at the same time, I had plenty of other things on my plate. And so suddenly having to pack in a whole load of additional reading to prep for this course, along with a much longer reading list, which was the sort of stuff we were supposed to be reading while we were on the course, that was again quite a kind of demanding element of what was going on, but it sort of set the tone for where it was heading. The High Commander Staff course itself is a very high profile course within the UK MOD. It's really kind of the course you have to do to go onwards and upwards up the career ladder. Without having done that, it's almost certainly a bit career limiting. It's a key role or key course to do. It certainly was then. And indeed, that proved to be the case. I mean, if I look at the 24 of us that were on the course, there were 3 international participants on it. The rest were all Brits, a mixture from each of the services, plus a few civil servants, mainly from either the Ministry of Defence or the Security and Intelligence Agencies, and all very capable people, all around about the group captain stroke 1-star Air Commodore rank or equivalent, and all with very diverse backgrounds, but clearly on the upward escalator. And you knew right from the off that this was going to be pretty intense. That was fed to you right from the start. It was a 3-month residential course that we lived at Shrivenham, the home of the Joint Service Command and Staff College, and that's the host organisation for this particular course. And you get there and you're straight into very busy days, very demanding schedules with lots and lots of lectures, lots of homework to do, lots of assignments you do as you go through, some in groups, some as individuals. And the interesting thing, I suppose, when you first got there was the feeling immediately of competition. You had 24 like-minded, very diverse background people who were all on the road to the top, but at the same time you were very, very conscious that road was going to be a competitive one, and we weren't all going to get everywhere we wanted to get to, and that was going to be challenging. So initially, the first few, I suppose 2 or 3 weeks of the course, it was really interesting to just see the human behavior. We were all kind of vying a little bit for position. It's an assessed course. You were graded on it. We knew that was the case right from the off. And so you're jockeying a little bit for position. The reality at the end of the course is all of the people that were on it are still good friends of mine. I worked with most of them for most of the rest of my career. Of the 21 Brits that were there, 2 of them made 4-star rank. Huge number made 2 or 3-star rank, nearly all of us actually, and only 1 or 2 that ended up leaving basically at the same rank that we'd started at. And so the success rate was massive, and you knew you were dealing with some really great people. And actually the fact that you then had downstream a collection of people who you were regularly working alongside in big jobs in the Ministry of Defence or in other roles, who you could rely on, who you had that kind of bond of friendship with, who you'd been through this experience, this sort of cauldron of activity that was the High Command and Staff course, was really, really, really useful. And it's a bit of a life lesson for wider things. I think that those kind of opportunities that generate really close networking, close friendships over a fairly intense period of time are invaluable, because they really do set you up for the sort of things that you're going to do downstream potentially, and really build you relationships that you can take to the long term. And relationships should always be a long-term business, and you should be looking to establish them and keep them warm and maintain them. And that's absolutely the case with the guys that were there on the HCSC. And we have a tremendous bond that is certainly still there to this day. The highlights of the course, I mean, there are so many. It's difficult to pick them out. I mean, apart from the fantastic people and the fantastic directing staff, we did some great stuff. We had lots and lots of wonderful speakers, very high-profile speakers who would come and talk to the course. All of it was Chatham House in terms of keeping it to yourself, what you'd actually heard there. And the result of that was you got some phenomenal insights on all sorts of things, mainly, very, very obviously, mainly defence-focused, but a bit broader than that as well. We worked with all sorts of people to give us a broader perspective, and also, of course, a much broader perspective across the 3 services. So well beyond your own service, a lot of the focus was around jointery and working tri-service, which was increasingly going to be the focus of everything that went on. And in fact, for me, the job that I'd had at Coningsby was the last single service appointment I had. So all of my appointments after leaving Coningsby were joint. So I was working in the tri-service environment for the rest of my military career, which gives you an idea how important that then is to actually have that and to really embrace it, I suppose, as an opportunity. The real highlight at the end of the Higher Commander Staff course is a thing called the Staff Ride, which is effectively a battlefield tour. It's into Europe. We had to do research. We had to present an individual element. Each element of the tour, one of the course would be leading on presenting on that element, and we'd had to research that in depth and then present that. And it was, again, an assessed part of what we were doing on the course. We were accompanied by the late Professor Richard Holmes, who, for anybody that's looked at military history, he is a very eminent military historian and was a terrific guy as well. He was a wonderful, wonderful man to be around. His knowledge depth was just extraordinary, and he was just so capable of bringing the history to life when you were going and dealing with these historical events. And that was very, very striking. And some of it I've never forgotten. We did a mixture of right back to kind of Napoleonic era stuff, and then also mostly, obviously, First and Second World War, and visited a lot of the various battlefields and significant sites in Normandy and around all of those areas where so much blood was shed, so much was lost in those two major conflicts. And Richard was just incredible. When we went to the Somme, for example, we were visiting battlefields on the Somme. His ability to turn around and literally translate the setting you were in to a kind of historical reality and for you to be able to almost visualize it as you were stood there was quite extraordinary. And it clearly was quite emotional for him as well, because he genuinely felt that he was passing on some really, really important stuff to us. And he was. I mean, standing in the start line as we did of the Accrington Pals Regiment, one of the Pals regiments from the First World War, looking at the cemetery that was where the German wire was, which was only about 160 meters away. We paced it out and had a look at it. And that was essentially within the space of 30 minutes where an entire generation of Italians young men were killed. And that was really, really striking when you're actually standing there on the ground and looking at that and realizing the enormity of the loss, the futility of the losses, particularly in terms of scale and so on, and just the sheer quantity of men. They were all men, obviously, that were slaughtered in that very, very bloody conflict. And that was just incredible to be with someone who had such historical knowledge and was able to bring that to life. And of course, we had fun. I mean, we had an amazing amount of fun doing this. It was a great road trip. We took a whole series of different cars. We were grouped up in 4 to a car, and obviously worked very closely with those people in that car around making sure we got to the right place at the right time. And that was part of the pressure that was on everyone, because some of these places are quite tricky to find. And when we were there overnight, obviously it was terrific. We had a wonderful time. The course came to an end, and we were all graded and assessed against each other. And actually all of us did really well. We were considered to be a very good course, and that was kind of reflected in where everyone got to downstream, I suppose, in terms of ranks. And then I knew from some way back that I was going from there, along with one other guy that was on the course with me, Duncan Potts, a Royal Naval officer. We were going to the Royal College of Defence Studies. And so another course in London, this time in Belgravia, in Belgrave Square, which is a place called Seaford House, which is where the Royal College of Defence Studies is. And it's a fantastic setting in a great location in a very well-to-do part of London. And the Royal College of Defence Studies is slightly misnamed in my view, because it really is an international relations course. There is a bit of defence flavour around it, and there are a lot of defence people on it. But the emphasis is on international relationships, not on defence. Completely different structure to the High Commander Staff course in all sorts of ways. About 85 members. We were members, not students on the course. And about 50 of those were from overseas locations and right across the world. So we had a participant from Chile and all the way out to Japan and the other side of the world, and everywhere you could think of in between. So, lots from Asia and Africa and Europe and America, South America, Central America, etc. So an incredibly diverse group of people. including places that are slightly more challenging in terms of relationships. So China, for example, we didn't have a Russian participant. We did have a Chinese one. And so you again had this very close bond. Sadly, Duncan and I arrived a term late because this course had actually started at that stage. It ran annually. It now runs on academic year. But it then was running annually. So they'd started in January when we'd started at the High Commander Staff course, and we dropped into it a term late. And it was quite deliberate that we'd done that because there was a concern at the time, not least from the international bodies that were sending people and nations that were sending people to the RCDS, that the UK was starting to deprioritize RCDS a bit and sending its best people to the High Command and Staff course and not to RCDS. And so we were the second year of a planned experiment, if you like, which was to put people onto both courses in a year. They'd done it with one Navy guy the previous year, and then Duncan and I both did it on this year in 2007. And it made it a bit more challenging because you obviously were dropping into a world where people had already formed quite tight relationships and knew everybody, and they'd done a bunch of stuff together, and we're now sort of arriving as the latecomers from this other course, and what did we know, et cetera, and so it was just a bit more challenging to break into those kind of circles of relationships. It also had an MA opportunity, a master's degree opportunity on this course, but sadly not for me because we arrived a term late and therefore we couldn't do the MA, which was much to my frustration because it meant that yet another opportunity was passing me by where I would potentially have been able to get a university level qualification and couldn't, even though the course obviously was running at master's level throughout. The fact that we missed the first term meant that was off the chart, which was a bit frustrating. So even to this day, I still sit there and I don't have a university degree, much to my sort of slight annoyance, I suppose. But at the same time, it hasn't really held me back in life, so I guess I can't complain that much. Another very amusing thing about the RCDS was I talked about the intensity of HCSC, and it was a really intense course, no doubt about it. Very pressurized, very competitive in all sorts of ways, and you really felt that. RCDS, we kind of knew that it was going to be completely different, and it was a more relaxed atmosphere, not least because, of course, with so many international participants and members on the course, you needed to have a slightly slower pace of life because most of them were working in a language that was not their native language, and they had to have time to process, time to read, time to reflect, etc. So it was inevitably going to be slightly slower. But it was very funny on the very first day that we were arriving at the beginning of the second term because Duncan and I were in HCSC mode, I think, and rolled up at 8:30 in the morning, to be there, ready to go, and we're right, where's everybody else? And we were kind of in the building with the cleaning crew, and no one else was vaguely in sight yet because we just were not tuned into that slower pace of life that was the RCDS in all its glory, and it was. From that point of view, it was a very nice opportunity to be a bit more considered about what you were able to do and to how you spent your time, give you a bit of battery recharge time in and alongside doing some really important developmental work, not least around the relationships. And again, the speakers that we had were quite extraordinary on RCDS. Vividly remember, for example, the King of Jordan came and it spoke to us as a course, and then took Q&A, and then we had a reception with him afterwards, and he spoke to, I think, pretty much everybody that was there. We had a visit by Her Majesty the Queen and Prince Philip during the time we were at RCDS as well. We had these very, very high-profile engagements, which were just stunningly impressive. We got a tour around Buckingham Palace that was kind of very much the behind the ropes tour from the private secretary to Her Majesty the Queen, and again, things you just don't forget, things that were unique opportunities that were really very, very special in terms of the way we were able to do it. The other very big highlights from that course were two tours this time. So we did a UK tour, which was only a few days. It was basically a working week. I went to Northern Ireland, and with a group of us, and we looked around Northern Ireland. And I, unlike a lot of my army colleagues, of course, had spent very little time in Northern Ireland. I'd never been there for work. I'd been there for a couple of times for sort of social events and things. And it was fascinating to be there in 2007 when it was politically quite a challenging time as well still, and to go and visit areas which are undoubtedly still quite challenged and get a really inside perspective from some really senior, major players in the country. And that was, again, very, very illuminating and something, again, I won't ever forget. And then we did an overseas tour, and the overseas tours for the Royal College of Defence Studies are amazing. They go properly global. We divided the course, I think, into about 7 or 8 groups. We went to a range of different places, and you were selected onto one of the kind of groups that was there, and we all had a chance to bid as to where you wanted to go. I think pretty much everyone wanted to go to China, but obviously only a certain amount of people can go to China. So I ended up going. My second choice, but it was a brilliant opportunity, which was to go to India and Pakistan. And we had 3 weeks. We had 2 weeks in India and a week in Pakistan. And again, not just on the tourist track. I mean, in India, we were in Delhi, then Jaipur, then Hyderabad, then Mumbai. We were meeting with really senior players that were there. The Alumni Association of RCDS in India timed their annual gathering to be when the RCDS is visiting. So we went along to this and were welcomed as kind of guests of honor as the current course. And that was fascinating because you look at the importance that some of the overseas nations put on people going on this course and what they got from it. I think there were something like 3 state governors, former state governors at this, and a state governor in India. I mean, given the huge population that's there and the power that they wield and so on, that is an immense job. Nearly all of their former RCDS members had become at least 3-star officers. And again, in a military that is massive, that's a really significant thing. And we also got to meet all sorts of interesting people. We went to the Human Rights Commission, for example, and had a great session with them. We were talking with people on education, rural education out in and around Jaipur. In Hyderabad, we went to Infosys and looked at the kind of Silicon Valley version of India, which was extraordinary to see the contrasts between the poverty level at one end. And we went to Dharavi slum in Mumbai and saw the extreme levels of poverty that exist in the country, but also then to go and see the kind of incredible success that they're building, and the span of that was just breathtaking to behold. And after 2 weeks in India, we trundled up to Pakistan, and we did Islamabad, we did Lahore. They would love to have taken us to places like the Khyber Pass, but the risks were too great, and from a security point of view, and we couldn't do that. And we couldn't go to Karachi for similar reasons. And we were there at an incredibly interesting time because President Musharraf was actually a former RCDS graduate, and he had historically paid close attention to RCDS. He'd always met the course when they'd come to Pakistan, etc. But Benazir Bhutto arrived back in Pakistan just before we arrived in Pakistan. And that was really tense. It was a very tense time. And of course, she was killed not that long later as well, assassinated in the country. And so we couldn't meet President Musharraf, which was a real shame. That would have been a lovely thing to do. But it was, again, an incredible insight into a very, very different, but equally very, very interesting country. And we loved our time in both India and in Pakistan. It was just a magnificent opportunity to see these things and places that you would never normally get to see. We did some touristy stuff. Obviously, we went in India. We went to the Taj Mahal, and we did a range of other things that would resemble tourist type activities. But we also did things that no tourist would ever do, particularly out on off the beaten track in both countries, actually, where we would go and see things that were just extraordinary, and the level of access and the real privilege you felt from that was tremendous. And so it was another course that was like that. It was full of memories, full of incredible opportunities, full of relationships. And again, I talked about the High Command and Staff course and being on the heels of a lot of these guys for the rest of my service time. RCDS was very similar. And indeed, beyond my military time, my RCDS relationships have continued very strongly. We have a very active reunion group. We meet every year doing something in various different countries we've been to so far. And that is a great way of keeping in touch. And not everybody's involved in it, but there's still a network of people there that I genuinely feel I can reach out to and contact. And that is back to my point about all these relationships are for the long term, and it's such an important thing to think about as a value add for you as an individual. So don't ever bypass these things if you get an opportunity to do them, even if it's something completely distinct from this type of course. One of the other advantages of RCDS for me personally was that tragically my mother, and not long after she'd come back from St. Lucia and being at our wedding, found out that she had cancer in early 2007. And it meant that for what was a very difficult year for her, but also for me, I'm an only child. Obviously, my mum had brought me up all my life after my father had died. I had time. The course was able to release me quite regularly. And actually, she ended up dying in November of 2007. So still while the course was running. And they were very, very generous and helpful to me in letting me be with her when it mattered most for a big chunk of time in that last year of her life. And I'll never forget that. That was such a critical opportunity to be able to have that very, very precious time with my mother, when only a year later I would have been in Afghanistan. It would have been a whole different problem. And obviously I'll talk about Afghanistan in much more detail on a different episode to this, but I just reflect how fortunate I was in many ways that the course that I was on and the type of course and the space they were able to give me meant that I was able to actually be in the right place to properly support my mum. It made for a pretty tough first year of marriage for me and my wife Saab, because obviously she had to deal with that. My mother effectively getting sicker and sicker through that year, and me being very busy on those two courses and spending a lot of time away from home while I was doing that. That was really tough. And again, then the second year wasn't any easier because I went straight off to Afghanistan. So it was a real baptism of fire for my poor new wife to find herself in that position. And as I've mentioned, Afghanistan loomed. I'd been promoted in the summer of the RCDS course. So halfway through it, basically, I'd become an Air Commodore, which was lovely. That was a fantastic thing. It was also fantastic for my mum to actually be able to see that and see yet another step on my success, if you like. And I know how proud she was of me and everything I'd achieved. And that meant the world that I was able to have that effectively just before she passed away. But it also set the conditions up for obviously going off to go and run the base at Kandahar, which was my destiny for the next job. And that will be, much as Coningsby was, the source of several podcasts because it was such a fascinating opportunity. But it was enabled in lots of ways by this year that I've just endured in the classroom, which was in many ways, a bit frustrating to be sat and doing training for a whole year. Also, what a phenomenal opportunity. I mean, one of the things the military does very, very well is provides those kind of opportunities and the space for you to go and do that really intense, deep, broad-based learning, which is not something that any corporate really allows. And so we were very, very lucky to be able to do that, and it was terrific. And I'm just profoundly grateful that I had those opportunities to build those networks, to see the things I saw, to hear the speakers I heard, and to get the experience that came from two quite amazing training opportunities. And that's it for this week. I hope it's interesting and gives you some kind of perspective of that kind of depth and breadth of things that we will get up to on those really, really big courses. And I'll see you next week. And I'll be talking with a guest next week, and you'll enjoy that, I'm sure, because it's going to be a really interesting guest. And I'm grateful for you listening, as ever. Thanks very much. Bye for now. I really hope you continue to enjoy these personal stories, but also all the other episodes that I provide on the podcast. And I'm enormously grateful. Always, I'm very grateful for your feedback, for your responses, for you sharing it widely. Please continue to do that. It really helps me if you share it widely on social media. It makes a very big difference. If you really value it and you enjoy what I do and you feel like financially contributing, that would be hugely, hugely helpful, because it's not cost-free, this stuff. It takes a lot of time. It does incur some physical cost in terms of actually making it run. And so your support is invaluable in that. And I'm particularly grateful to have a new patron level on my Patreon channel of Adam King. I'm very grateful to you indeed for joining as a patron. Thank you very much indeed. And a champion who I didn't actually mention previously, but Tom Jarvis, who's also joined me as a champion. both of you, I'm profoundly grateful. That really makes a big difference, and thank you very much indeed. I hugely appreciate it. If you want to join them and support me financially, then www.patreon.com/leading4life will get you there. And you can join as either a supporter, a patron, or a champion of the show. You can also find the support the show link in your podcast platform of choice, and that will take you to exactly the same place. And if you're up for doing that, I would be immensely grateful to you. But I'm equally very grateful just to have you listening and hopefully enjoying what I provide. Thanks ever so much. Speak soon. Bye.